Hi guys, this is Tom. I'm in my studio and I wanted to do a little introduction to a series of videos that I've wanted to do for quite a while, but I haven't had a chance. And now, given the current kind of COVID-19 goings on, I have an opportunity to do so. And I think it's going to be a nice little series for people to kind of tune into once or twice a week, as a bit of escapism. And also, hopefully, some people will actually fancy kind of following through and doing the little painting that I'm doing. And this whole series is going to be on painting quick, kind of loose, splashy watercolour birds. So not overly complex, no extremely laboured processes, just really quick, fun little paintings that can be done on the spot fairly easily with limited materials. So watercolour is perfect for this. It's really transportable, it's not particularly messy, you can carry a tiny little pad around with you, just a few colours, a tiny little pot, a tiny little palette, one or two brushes, and that's it. As long as you've got a bit of water on hand, you're good to go. So in this video, I'm just going to simply talk you through some of the basics of my materials, what might be handy for you to have, and how simple watercolour can be. And then we're going to get into painting some birds in the next video. Okay, so the first thing to talk you through is something to put your water in. I've got my lovely big handmade water carrier here, but you could use anything, old mug, couple of jam jars or a big jam jar. I just like something that holds loads of water because it means that you have to change it less often, and I'm a bit lazy basically. Yeah, so you can use anything you want. Then after that, we're going to move into looking at the palettes. So this first one is a really great choice. It's nice and light, super easy to use, doesn't take up too much space. These big areas are great for mixing big watery washes, and then I tend to put my neat paint out of the tube on the top areas, and I also in those top areas mix some of the slightly damper washes where there's a lot less water, and they're a little bit more saturated. So that's great with a lot of variety. Then this option is my really big palette that I love using for all of my paintings, whatever the size, but you absolutely don't need anything this big for this particular series of paintings. Again, it should be a lot cleaner than this, but it's super easy to wash. So I tend to mix my big washes in these areas, lots of water, put my paint at the top area. Yeah, these areas can hold loads of water and loads of paint. And then the great thing is these little middle areas that are slightly on a slope, the water drains out and it creates a slightly damper, more saturated, less watery wash. So this idea of all of these different paint kind of consistencies and textures is not overly complicated at all, but it's something I'll talk about in the actual videos themselves. But that's my favourite palette. You absolutely don't need anything that big. This next one is a really great choice. You'll see this everywhere, especially in art shops. I can't open them at all because I never used them. There's a bit of a knack, but I get there eventually. So these are what are called pans instead of watercolor tubes. There's a nice little mix of colors here, but you can choose your own colors. And then on the left hand side, you've got a few nice little spots to actually mix your paint in a variety of consistencies. These are really great because they're super small, super lightweight, easy to use. They're perfect to carry about and use anywhere, and they're perfect for this little series of quick splashy watercolors. If you haven't got enough space to mix paint, then you can just pop out an old lid off something or an old plate or anything like that to mix the paint on. Doesn't need to be fussy. So the next option is basically a variation on a theme. You keep all of your tubes down the middle, and then the left and right you have for mixing your paint. On the left hand side would be where I would mix my bigger watery washes. On the right hand side is where I would put my neat paint and I would mix my more saturated washes. So that's pretty straightforward. Again, it could do with a clean, but you kind of get the idea. I don't use these that often, just kind of talking you through the options. Then this one is basically a much bigger version of the slightly smaller one I just showed you. Equally hard to open for me. Way more colours than I would ever want or need, so I would take all of those out and just put in a few colours, or even just use it to carry my tubes, and then use the left and right hand sides to actually mix the paint. The left hand side I would mix my slightly more saturated damp washes. The right hand side, because they're a little bit deeper, is where I would mix my much more watery washes. So nice, simple, lightweight, dead easy, lots more space to mix with, so another good option. And you could use it with tubes or you could use it with pans. So there we go. The next thing that I'm going to talk you through is what we actually are going to paint on. So the first thing I'm going to look at is a fairly standard sketchbook. So these are great. These are a company called Cardi. It's cotton rag paper, which is really lovely to work on, but there's a huge amount of variation out there. As usual, the best you can afford, because the cheap ones aren't that great, but they are fine for messing around in. These are just a little bit better quality, but they're still kind of a sketchbook feel. I don't use my sketchbook anywhere near as much as I should. This is a great example of the beauty of watercolour paint in its own right. Here I've just laid down paint and let it blend together, let it mix, and just see what it does. And this is going to be a big part of this series, is just laying down lovely wet paint, letting the paint do its thing, adding a little bit of detail and a little bit of tightness in a few places, and just kind of seeing what we get. A lot of watercolour is letting go and just letting the paint sort of do what it wants to do and working with that. This one is obviously a much bigger version of the smaller one. You can see I've been messing around with loads of different ideas in here, just having a bit of a play. Sketchbooks are great because we become less attached to an outcome and a final result. They're kind of where we can mess around without things feeling too critical, and you can see that's what I'm kind of doing here. These couple of pages I'm just sort of playing around with the brush, seeing what the brush can do, and playing around with kind of light and movement. Obviously as well, you can get single sheets of watercolour paper, but I think for these little exercises and for sake of ease and transportability, these sorts of things that I'm talking you through are great. So these are my favourite thing, and this is what I'm going to be doing the majority of this series on. These are gummed pads, or a block of watercolour paper. So you've got about 20, I think 15, whatever, individual sheets, but they're gummed all the way around the edge, so the sheet is held very tight and very flat, so you don't have to stretch it out. When you're done, you just slot a knife or a palette knife down the back here, run it around the edge, and take your sheet of paper off. So these are really great. They're non-fuss. You kind of just take it out and get painting. If you end up with a masterpiece, you can whip it off and you know, you've got a nice little good quality sheet of paper there with a painting on. If you don't end up with a masterpiece, you can take the paper off, turn it over and try again. Highly transportable, super easy to use. I've got a variety of them. This has got a particularly rough texture, which I really like. And that's kind of it. They come in a variety of sizes. You get different qualities. As usual, even if you're just starting out, the best quality that you can afford, because the really cheap stuff just doesn't work particularly well. It's not particularly fun to paint on, and it buckles and it goes all horrible. This stuff might buckle a little bit, but only if we chuck loads of water on, and even if it does buckle, it won't be too much. So I highly recommend these. There's loads of different brands out there. Winsor & Newton Professional is one of the ones I use. Canson is another great one. I've also got a company called Hanimal. They make a whole load of different ones, slightly bigger ones, same principle though. You just run a knife around the edge when you're done, and that's that. And also one of my other favourite papers, which reacts a little bit differently to other watercolour papers, is Jackson's Eco paper. It's cotton rag, and it just stays wet a little bit longer. It's a little bit duller in colour, but I do really love it as a watercolour paper. It's great fun to work on. And again, this is just a block where you whip the knife around the edge. And that's it, guys. It doesn't have to be hugely complicated, just the best quality that you can kind of find and that you can justify spending money on. Okay, so the next obvious thing is we need something to actually put the paint on with, that being a brush. Well, you could use your fingers or your hand, but I'm going to stick with a brush. I've got a whole load of brushes here, but pretty much I could forget all of those and just pick this one and this one and get rid of all of them. And even with my bigger paintings, I pretty much just use a big brush and one small brush. For these little ones, you could even get away with one of these, but basically this is a kind of like a round mop brush, you might call it. This is a size 16. It's great because it holds loads of water for doing big areas, but believe it or not, they come to an incredibly fine point for doing detail. If I can't quite get to a fine enough point, then I've got a smaller round brush, which is a size 8 by Jackson's. It's the Studio synthetic one, and it's great for doing finer detail. When these brushes are wet, they come to a really fine point. You could have a whole load of brushes, but really I pretty much only use 2. Every so often I might pull out one of the big guns for a really big painting, but yeah, that'll do me. And then also I forgot to mention a rubber. I've got an HB and a 2H pencil, nothing particularly fancy, and a pencil sharpener. And that's kind of it. And then the only thing left to talk about is the paints. Okay, so this is my box of paints. These are all my watercolours that I use. Beautifully organised as always, bit of paper in there, bit of tissue, nice bit of old plastic, something. Yeah, and so obviously you could pick a whole range of colours, but for this and most painting, actually we don't need many. If you've got a really limited amount of money or resources, or you just don't want to spend any more, or you just want to use the colours that you've got, one of each primary at the very least is a great place to start. If you can justify it, 2 of each primary, a warm and a cool. Actually, I'll just talk you through what the options are. So for example, a really common warm red would be cadmium. I prefer something called permanent red. So the red is more orangey and warmer, whereas my much cooler red would be something like quinacridone magenta, carmine red, alizarin crimson, although I tend not to use that so much because it fades fairly easily. Rose madder is a very pinky red. Pyrrole red is more orangey. So you don't have to have all of these. I'm just talking you through some of the options. If I was really homing it down, I would pick a permanent red or a cadmium red or a vermilion red and a quinacridone red, which is red, which is much cooler. But yeah, if you're struggling to know what to use, guys, I'm going to mention colours at the beginning of every single painting, so don't worry too much. So for me, the obvious warm blue is ultramarine. This is actually ultramarine deep. It's like a lovely gentle purpley blue, so it's warm because it's got a bit of red in it. Your cool blue, you could go with something like Prussian. Indigo is very strong and quite muted, so it is a great colour, great for getting deep darks. Phthalo blue is a lovely vibrant greeny blue, so it's a little bit cooler. I also love manganese blue. Again, it's a lovely cool, slightly lighter blue. So those are all great. I only use transparent colours. That's just the way I like it. I find it a little easier to not get mud, if that makes sense. Opaque colours can go muddier a little bit easier, but this is something to talk about in more detail in another video. The point of this exercise or these videos is that I want to keep things really simple and kind of pared back down to basics. Just a quick note, I really love Holbein watercolours, and I also use another company, Golden, which are very well known for their acrylics, but they also make watercolours called Core Watercolours. These are fantastic. These are all artist quality, so they can be expensive. The Holbein ones are not too bad. As usual, guys, if you can afford artist quality paints, it makes things a little bit easier. They tend to react a little bit better and you get better results. They don't have to be really expensive. There's loads of great artist quality watercolours out there. So let's look at the yellows. A classic cool yellow is lemon yellow. I found this really bizarrely named colour called imidazolone yellow, and then later found out it was basically lemon yellow. And that's a lovely cool, slightly greeny yellow. I only really have one of those. And then my warm yellow that I absolutely love, a very orangey, hence warm yellow, is New Gamboge, and it's a really great colour, especially when you start mixing it with some of the reds. You get lovely warm oranges. The imidazolone will give you more vibrant, brighter greens. I do have a few like secondary colours in the mix as well. You can obviously mix these, but I've got a load of colours. One of them is Hooker's Green, lovely vibrant transparent green, and I've got a couple of oranges, as well as all of these, which I occasionally dip into. But some of the colours I really love are turquoises, and I love them straight out of the tube. I've got a phthalo turquoise there, and a turquoise blue, and a few other things knocking about. What's we got here? That's carmine. I've got a few other colours like, oh, Indanthrone blue is a lovely one, but I don't want to get too much into that. I want to keep it really simple for these, so a warm and a cool version of each primary. If I was really wanting to narrow it down to absolute basics, that would be permanent red, quinacridone red, ultramarine, phthalo blue, imidazolone yellow, new gamboge, and a turquoise. If I was going to really reduce things down, I would get rid of that, and that. And there, I just love turquoise, but in theory you could get rid of that. You've got to understand though that there will be some colours that you literally will not be able to mix with those 3 particular primaries, which is why I recommend one of each primary. But as I said, I'm going to talk about colours more at the beginning of every video that I do. So that's it guys, real brief introduction into some simple watercolour materials and kind of basic practices, and that's all paving the way for this new series to come. If you've got any questions at all, please just let me know. You can see a lot more of my videos and tutorials. There's a few on YouTube, but most of mine kind of go through Patreon, and you can jump on there and have a look at all the various tiers I've got on offer. Again, those links will be either in the bio or in the information below, depending on where you're viewing this. So that's it, I shall catch you in the first instalment of this new series of watercolour birds.